Story 1. The Pizza Delivery. It was supposed to be an ordinary late-night shift delivering pizzas. The kind of night I was used to: quiet roads, a podcast playing in the background, and maybe a good tip or two. But this night was anything but ordinary. The order came in just after 10 p.m. for large pizzas. The address was nearly 20 minutes away, down a series of winding, unpaved roads. It was unusual, but not unheard of where I lived. People in the outskirts ordered late sometimes, and I figured it was probably a party. Bigger orders often meant better tips, so I didn't think much of it. I grabbed the pizzas and headed out. The drive started normally enough, but as I got further from town, the surroundings grew darker and eerier. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my tires and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. My headlights barely cut through the thick darkness, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. When I finally reached the address, I almost turned around and left. The house was more like a decrepit old building, sitting alone in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. Its wooden facade was weathered and warped, the windows dark and lifeless. There were no lights, no cars, no signs of life. The only indication that anyone might be there was the faint glow of a porch light, flickering like it was on its last breath. I parked the car but didn't get out right away. Something about the place felt wrong. I double-checked the address on the receipt against my GPS. It matched. Still uneasy, I called my boss to confirm. He was in no mood for my hesitation and barked at me to deliver the pizzas or risk paying for them myself. With a deep breath, I grabbed the pizzas and stepped out into the cool night air. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets. As I approached the front door, I noticed small details that made my stomach churn: deep scratches on the wooden doorframe, the faint smell of decay in the air. There was no doorbell, so I knocked. My fist against the wood echoed unnaturally, like the sound was being swallowed by the house itself. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out, "Pizza delivery." Still nothing. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a faint shuffling sound from inside. It wasn't footsteps, it was more like something dragging across the floor. "Hello?" I called, my voice wavering. "I've got your pizzas." A shadow shifted behind one of the upstairs windows. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel eyes on me. Wide, unblinking eyes. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the shadow was gone. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I thought about my boss's threats and decided to try one last time. I set the pizzas on the porch, knocked hard on the door, and turned to leave. That's when I noticed the woods had gone silent. The crickets, the rustling leaves, even the distant hoot of an owl, all gone. The only sound was my own breathing, growing faster by the second. I hurried back to my car and got in, slamming the door shut. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. Panic surged through me as I tried again. On the third attempt, the car roared to life, and I felt a brief wave of relief. That relief vanished when I felt the car lurch and rock, as if something heavy had landed on the trunk. I glanced in the rearview mirror but saw nothing. Then came the sound of metal scraping against metal, a horrible screeching noise that made my skin crawl. The car shuddered and came to a sudden stop. I stepped out to check, keeping my flashlight in hand. All 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber shredded like it had been clawed apart. A chill ran down my spine as I shined the flashlight toward the house. The pizzas were gone. In their place was a small object, glinting faintly in the beam of light. I crept closer, heart pounding, and saw that it was an old, rusted knife. Dried blood caked the blade. A low, guttural sound came from the forest behind me. It wasn't an animal, it was something else, something unnatural. My flashlight beam shook as I turned toward the noise. 2 pale, glistening eyes stared back at me from the darkness. They blinked, slowly, deliberately, and then began to move closer. I dropped the flashlight in my panic and bolted back to the car. I locked the doors and grabbed my phone, frantically dialing 911. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline, but I couldn't focus on her words. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see those eyes again. And then I did. The figure was inside the car. It sat in the back seat, partially obscured by shadows, its face twisted into a grotesque parody of a smile. Its skin was pale and waxy, stretched too tightly over its bones. The eyes were impossibly wide, unblinking, and fixed on me. A low, rattling sound came from its throat, like it was trying to speak but couldn't form the words. I didn't think. I threw open the door and ran into the woods, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The sound of footsteps followed me, heavy and uneven. My lungs burned as I ran, but I didn't dare stop. I finally found a large tree and crouched behind it, trying to steady my breathing. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. Then came the whispering. Dozens of voices, overlapping and indistinct, seemed to surround me. My head spun as I tried to pinpoint their source. Suddenly, a hand reached around the tree, pale and skeletal, its nails sharp and dirty. I screamed and bolted again, bursting out of the woods and onto the dirt road just as red and blue lights came into view. The police had arrived. I stumbled toward them, waving frantically, and collapsed as they reached me. They searched the house and the surrounding area but found no one. The only evidence was a set of sharp metal spikes, hidden near the driveway, and the pizzas discarded in the woods. The officers told me it was probably some deranged squatters trying to scare people off. But I knew better. Whatever I saw that night wasn't human. That I quit my job the next morning. Even now, years later, I can still see those eyes in my nightmares. Story 2. The Whispering Watcher. It was the summer of 2016, and like most weekends, my friends and I had spent the night roaming the town, indulging in late-night drinks and laughter. We wandered through the quiet neighborhood streets, our voices echoing in the stillness. Everything was calm until one of my friends stopped abruptly and pointed. "Look," he whispered. In the shadows of a bush outside someone's house, a figure was crouched, barely visible. At first, we thought it might be an animal, but the shape was unmistakably human. Curiosity mixed with unease as we edged closer. The figure didn't move, but an eerie, guttural sound began to emanate from the bush. It wasn't loud, but it was unnatural, like a low growl combined with distorted whispers. We froze. My instincts screamed to leave, but the absurdity of the situation kept us rooted in place. Then, the figure twitched. It was a small, jerky motion, but it was enough to send us all screaming and bolting down the street. In the safety of Dive's stance, we laughed nervously, brushing it off as some weirdo playing a prank. Eventually, we parted ways and headed home, the encounter fading into a strange, unsettling memory. That night, sleep came easily. The drinks and the exhaustion pulled me into a deep slumber. But sometime in the early hours, I woke up suddenly. My room was cloaked in darkness, the kind that seemed to press in on me. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't move. My arms, legs, even my head felt pinned in place. Panic flared as I realized I was experiencing sleep paralysis, something I'd only heard about but never encountered before. As my eyes darted around the room, a familiar unease began to creep over me. It started as a faint sound, a whispering noise that grew louder with every passing second. My blood ran cold as I recognized it, the same guttural, distorted sound from the bush. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The whispers grew closer. My gaze shifted to the foot of my bed, and that's when I saw it. A head hovered in the darkness, its features grotesque and otherworldly. The face was stretched and contorted, the skin pale and almost translucent, as if it barely clung to the skull beneath. Its eyes were black pits, empty and unblinking. A wide grin split its face, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. My stomach churned as the head began to move closer, gliding through the air like a predator closing in on its prey. As it approached, the rest of its body emerged from the shadows. It was hunched and misshapen, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, with clawed hands that scraped against the floor. The creature seemed to absorb the darkness around it, blending into the shadows as if it were a part of them. It stopped inches from my face, its rancid breath washing over me. The whispers turned into a cacophony, voices overlapping and echoing in my mind. I felt as though it was speaking directly to me, though I couldn't understand the words. My entire body screamed for escape, but I was trapped, helpless beneath its gaze. The creature tilted its head, studying me, its grin widening. One clawed hand reached out, its jagged nails hovering just above my chest. I could feel its cold presence pressing down on me, suffocating and relentless. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The whispers ceased, and the oppressive weight lifted. I shot upright, gasping for air, my heart racing like it would burst from my chest. My room was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon streaming through the window. But the air felt wrong, heavy and charged with an unseen energy. I turned on every light in the room, desperate to banish the lingering darkness. The hours until dawn felt endless, and every shadow seemed to shift and move under my wary gaze. When the first rays of sunlight finally pierced through the window, I stumbled out of bed, my legs trembling beneath me. I told my parents everything, my words spilling out in a jumbled mess. They chalked it up to sleep paralysis and the lingering effects of alcohol, but I could see the unease in their eyes. They couldn't even explain the unnatural details I described. Over the next few weeks, I struggled to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I feared I would see it again. The memory of its face haunted me, appearing in vivid detail whenever I let my guard down. I started keeping a flashlight by my bed, a futile attempt to ward off the darkness. The faintest noises, creaks in the floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside, would send my heart racing. One night, as I lay awake, I thought I heard the whispers again. Faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. I bolted upright, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, and scanned the room. Nothing. But the fear had taken root, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The following morning, I decided to confide in one of my friends who had been with me that night. As I recounted the experience, his face paled, and he admitted he'd been having strange dreams too. In his, the figure from the bush was always there, watching from the edges of his vision but never coming closer. We both agreed to avoid the area where we'd seen it, but the damage was done. The memory of that night, of that creature, had left its mark. To this day, I don't know what I experienced. Was it just a vivid hallucination brought on by sleep paralysis? Or was it something else, something darker and far more real? I'll never forget the way it looked at me, as if it had been waiting, watching, and had finally decided to make itself known. And I'll never forget the sound, that guttural, inhuman whisper that still echoes in my nightmares. Whatever it was, it hasn't left me, and I don't think it ever will. Story 3. The Submerged Room. It started as a typical urban exploration adventure. For years, my friends and I had been diving into abandoned buildings, drawn to the decaying beauty of forgotten places. This time, though, we found something that still chills me to the bone. We had heard whispers about a mansion submerged halfway in a lake deep in the woods. The story went that the lake hadn't always been there. A dam collapsed decades ago had flooded the valley, swallowing the mansion whole. Some claimed the family who lived there never escaped, their restless spirits trapped underwater. The idea of exploring an underwater ruin was irresistible, so we packed our diving gear and set out on what we thought would be just another thrilling escapade. When we arrived, the lake was eerily still, its surface like a mirror reflecting the overcast sky. In the center stood the top half of the mansion, its roof jagged and broken. Creeping vines trailed into the water, and the windows were black holes, staring back at us like empty sockets. Even the birds were silent, as if the lake demanded reverence. It was as if the house itself was watching. We anchored our boat and suited up. My friend Jake was the first to dive in, followed by Liz and then me. As we descended, the world above faded into a muted blur, replaced by the murky green of the water. The mansion loomed larger as we approached, its once grand facade now encrusted with algae and barnacles. Fish darted in and out of the windows, and the silence was broken only by the sound of our breathing through the regulators. We entered through a shattered window, careful not to cut ourselves on the jagged glass. Inside, The water was darker, the sunlight barely penetrating the gloom. The furniture, though waterlogged, was eerily intact. A dining table stood in the center of what must have been a grand hall, its chairs scattered as if the occupants had fled in haste. Faded portraits lined the walls, their faces distorted and unrecognizable. One painting, however, caught my eye, a family portrait where the faces had been scratched out, leaving only hollow impressions. I felt a chill run down my spine. As we moved deeper, we found an ornate staircase leading to the upper floors. The wood creaked beneath our weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was groaning, protesting our presence. Jake motioned for us to follow him, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. That's when we found the room. It was at the end of a long corridor, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the water seemed clearer, the light from our flashlights illuminating every detail. It was a child's bedroom, untouched by time. A small bed sat against the wall, its quilt neatly folded. Toys were scattered on the floor, and a dollhouse rested on a table by the window. But what caught my attention were the photographs. They were pinned to the walls, dozens of them, each one perfectly preserved despite the water. I swam closer, my stomach tightening as I realized what I was looking at. They were pictures of me. Me as a child, me with my family, me in places I'd been just weeks ago. Each photo was impossibly accurate, as if someone had been following me my entire life. My breath hitched, and my regulator slipped slightly, flooding my mouth with a bitter taste of lake water. I quickly adjusted it, but my panic was rising. Liz tapped my shoulder, her eyes wide behind her mask. She pointed to the dollhouse. Inside, we saw tiny figures, crafted with painstaking detail. They looked like us. Jake, Liz, and me posed exactly as we had been moments earlier, standing in front of the photographs. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone, or something, was watching us. Jake gestured for us to leave, his movements frantic. We turned to go, but the door slammed shut, the force sending a cloud of silt into the water. The room seemed to darken, the walls closing in. A low hum filled my ears, growing louder until it became a deafening roar. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if the water itself was squeezing the air out of me. Then, the whispers started. They were faint at first, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But as they grew louder, I realized they were speaking to me. "Stay," they hissed, the words stretching and echoing in my mind. "Stay with us." Liz grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. Together, we forced the door open and swam into the corridor. Jake was ahead of us, his flashlight swinging wildly. The house seemed alive now, its walls pulsating and shifting. Furniture floated toward us, blocking our path, and the whispers followed, growing more insistent. As we reached the staircase, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down and saw a hand, a pale, skeletal hand emerging from the darkness below. I kicked frantically, breaking free, and swam as fast as I could. Liz screamed through her regulator, her muffled cries echoing in the confined space. Jake was shouting too, pointing toward a window at the end of the hall. We raced toward it, the whispers now a cacophony of voices, each one pleading, commanding us to stay. We finally reached the window and scrambled out, kicking furiously toward the surface. My lungs burned as I fought the urge to breathe. When we broke through the water, I ripped off my mask and gasped for air, my heart pounding like a drum. Back in the boat, we sat in stunned silence, unable to speak. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the mansion. In the topmost window, I saw a figure watching us. It was a child, her face pale and her eyes dark hollows. She raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave, and the whispers returned, faint but clear, "Come back." We never spoke of what happened that day. Jake and Liz refused to acknowledge it, brushing it off as a trick of the light or a hallucination brought on by the water pressure. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. The photographs, the dollhouse, the child in the window, they weren't hallucinations. Something is still down there, waiting, watching. Over the following weeks, the nightmares began. In my dreams, I was back in that room, the whispers louder and more insistent. The photographs on the walls changed, showing me trapped in the house, my face frozen in a silent scream. The dollhouse grew larger, its figures coming to life, their empty eyes following me wherever I went. And always, in the background, the child watched, her hollow gaze piercing and unrelenting. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the whispers again. Faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. And every time I close my eyes, I see that room, perfectly preserved, waiting for me to return. Story 4. The Marionette. Evan had always been fascinated by the art of puppetry. For years, he struggled as a young puppeteer, performing small, unnoticed shows in parks and community theaters. It was his passion, though, and he spent every spare moment refining his craft. But no matter how much effort he poured into his performances, the audiences were sparse, their applause tepid at best. Everything changed the day he walked into a dimly lit antique shop tucked in a forgotten alley. Dust motes floated in the stale air as the shopkeeper, an elderly man with an unsettling, toothy grin, led Evan to a back room. "I have something you'll appreciate," the man said, his voice a hoarse whisper. There, on a pedestal, was a marionette unlike anything Evan had ever seen. It was carved from dark wood, polished to a gleaming finish, yet its features were unerringly lifelike. Its limbs were jointed with delicate precision, and its blue eyes seemed to sparkle with an unnatural brilliance. It had an aura that drew Evan closer. "Where did this come from?" Evan asked, his voice tinged with both awe and unease. "It's been passed down," the shopkeeper said vaguely. "It's special. But be warned, some things are best left untouched." The shopkeeper offered it for a price so low that Evan couldn't resist. Ignoring the warning, he took the marionette home, eager to incorporate it into his act. The first performance with the marionette was electric. From the moment Evan brought it onto the stage, the audience was captivated. The marionette moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible, its lifelike gestures transcending anything Evan had ever achieved before. By the end of the show, the audience was on their feet, cheering and applauding. It was a success like he'd never experienced. Afterward, a little girl approached him, her face pale and her voice trembling. "Your puppet," it blinked. Evan laughed nervously and assured her it was just her imagination. But later that night, as he packed the marionette into its case, he thought he saw its eyes shift, just for a moment. He shook it off as a trick of the light. The shows became increasingly popular. Word spread quickly about the puppeteer with the mesmerizing, almost supernatural marionette. With each performance, Evan noticed the audience's reactions grew more intense, not just entertained, but riveted, sometimes unnerved. One evening, as Evan rehearsed alone in his studio, he began to notice subtle changes in the marionette. The strings seemed to tangle themselves, even when untouched. Its limbs, which had once moved only when controlled, sometimes appeared slightly shifted when he turned his back. Then there were the eyes, those unnervingly vivid blue eyes that seemed to follow him no matter where he stood. One night, as he was locking up, he heard a faint tapping sound. He turned, expecting to see a loose window or a shifting floorboard, but the sound was coming from the marionette's case. Heart pounding, Evan approached and hesitantly lifted the lid. The puppet was lying exactly as he'd left it, but its head was now tilted at an angle that made it seem as if it were staring directly at him. He slammed the case shut, trying to dismiss his growing paranoia. But the tapping persisted, louder now, as though the puppet was trying to claw its way out. The following week, during a sold-out performance, something extraordinary and terrifying happened. As Evan manipulated the marionette, it moved with a fluidity beyond anything he had rehearsed. Its gestures were almost human, its head turning to look at specific audience members, its hands extending as though reaching for them. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Evan felt a strange pulse in the strings as if the puppet was resisting his control. The climax of the performance came when the marionette lunged toward the front row. A woman screamed, and the audience erupted into a mix of laughter and uneasy murmurs. Evan bowed, but his hands were shaking as he packed up the puppet that night. He swore the marionette's expression had shifted into a subtle, mocking smile. As Evan's fame grew, so did his unease. The marionette grew heavier, its wood darker and veined with what looked like sinewy patterns. During rehearsals, it sometimes felt as though the puppet was guiding him, not the other way around. At night, Evan would wake to the faint sound of laughter echoing from the studio below. Then came the whispers. They started faintly, just on the edge of hearing. Evan dismissed them as the wind or his imagination. But over time, the voices grew louder, their words clearer. "Let me out, free me, I can make you greater." One night, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, Evan locked himself in the studio and confronted the marionette. He placed it on the workbench, its lifeless form illuminated by a single overhead light. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with an audible creak, the marionette's head turned to face him. Its mouth opened, and a guttural, rasping voice emerged. "I am no puppet," it hissed. "I am imprisoned." Evan stumbled back, his mind reeling. The marionette explained, haltingly, as though the words pained him, that it was a creature of darkness, bound in wood centuries ago by a master puppeteer who sought to contain its power. It had been feeding on the fear of Evan's audiences, growing stronger with each performance. "Release me," it demanded, its blue eyes burning like cold fire. "And I will give you everything you desire." Evan refused. He grabbed a hammer and raised it, intending to destroy the puppet. But before he could strike, the marionette strings snapped to life, coiling around his wrists and yanking him backward. He screamed as the strings tightened, cutting into his skin like barbed wire. "You cannot destroy me," the marionette growled, its wooden limbs twisting unnaturally as it climbed onto his chest. "But you can join me." The room plunged into darkness. Evan felt the strings tightening around his throat, his vision blurring as the marionette's face loomed closer. The last thing he saw was its sneering grin, its eyes glowing with malevolent triumph. Weeks later, a new puppeteer appeared in a neighboring town, performing with a marionette that left audiences spellbound and terrified. The puppet was unlike anything they'd ever seen, its lifelike features eerily familiar, its blue eyes burning with a sinister light, and in its hand, it held a tiny figure carved from wood, a perfect replica of Evan, his face frozen in a silent scream. Story 5. The Screaming Forest. There are places in the world where the air itself feels wrong. The deeper you go, the more suffocating the silence becomes, as though the land is holding its breath, waiting for something. And then, there are places like the Screaming Forest, where the air is thick with dread, and the silence is punctuated by screams that defy reason. Leah and her group of hikers had heard the stories. They had all heard the rumors, murmurs shared in hushed tones around campfires, whispers in the dark corners of local bars, tales of a forest untouched by time, cursed by an unknown force. Some said it was haunted by the souls of the lost. Others believed it was a portal to something darker. But to Leah and her friends, the stories were nothing more than superstition, the kind of things people spoke of to add mystery to a place that had none. They were wrong. It began as an innocent enough hike. Leah, the leader, had mapped out a new route in the remote woods of the Pacific Northwest, far from the usual trails. The sun had risen high, casting long shadows over the trail as they entered the forest, their boots crunching on the carpet of fallen leaves and twigs. The deeper they ventured, the quieter it became, and the further they left the comfort of civilization behind. Birds ceased to sing. Even the wind seemed to hush. "Feels like we're the only ones here," Marcus, the youngest of the group, remarked. His voice was steady, but Leah noticed the slight edge of unease creeping into it. Leah smiled, though her own thoughts were clouded with a sense of being watched. She pushed it aside. "It's just a forest," she said, but even she couldn't deny the strange heaviness hanging in the air. They pressed on, the path narrowing until they were forced to push through thick underbrush. Hours passed, and the forest grew denser. The trees seemed older here, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches thick with moss, blocking out most of the light. Despite the oppressive shade, Leah noticed something else. The air was cold. Not the kind of coolness that came with altitude for the time of day, but a deep, unnatural chill, as though the forest itself exhaled a shiver. Then, it happened. A scream echoed through the trees. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human, either. It was a sound that clung to the edges of sanity, something primal and raw, filled with agony. It came from deep within the woods, distant but unmistakable. Leah froze. Her friends stopped too, their eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. Leah nodded. Probably just a fox or something. But she wasn't sure. The sound had been too clear, too human in its distress. Another scream, this time closer. The forest seemed to hold its breath. There was no other noise, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just that haunting wail that seemed to twist the air itself. "We should turn back," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "No," Leah said, though her gut twisted with the weight of his suggestion. "We came this far. We find the source, and then we leave." The group reluctantly agreed, and they followed the path deeper into the forest, each step more hesitant than the last. The trees thickened, their trunks bending at strange angles, creating an almost tunnel-like feeling. The air grew colder with each passing minute. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became. And the scream, it never ceased. It just hovered in the air, like a shadow, waiting to pounce. Suddenly, they stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a series of tall and weathered wooden totems, their forms crude but striking. The totems resembled human figures, their faces carved into grotesque masks of terror, their eyes wide with unspeakable fear, their mouths open in silent screams. Some of the faces were contorted into expressions of pain so vivid that it was as if they were frozen in a moment of horror, caught in time. Leah's breath caught in her throat. Something about the totems felt wrong. The way they loomed over them as if they were watching, waiting. "What are these?" Emma whispered, moving closer to one of the figures. She reached out to touch it, but the instant her fingers brushed the wood, the scream returned, louder, more frantic. It was no longer distant. It surrounded them, coming from all directions, echoing through the trees. They spun around, looking for the source, but there was nothing. "Only the totems." "Stop," Leah said, her voice shaky. "We need to get out of here." But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. In the distance, through the trees, she thought she saw movement. A tall and thin shadow crossed the ground in a blur. She blinked, but it was gone. "Leah, we need to go," Marcus insisted. "This place isn't right." Before Leah could respond, she heard it again, a voice, faint but unmistakable. Her own name was called from somewhere far off, deep in the woods. "Leah," she spun around, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" "Leah, it's too late," the voice was clearer now. It was her own voice, but distorted, twisted in a way that made her skin crawl. She turned back to the totems, staring at the faces carved into the wood, as if they were mocking her. The scream had subsided for a moment, replaced by the sound of her name echoing through the trees, pulling her deeper into the forest. "No," Leah whispered, her pulse quickening. "We need to go. Now." But as they turned to leave, something changed. The forest shifted. The ground seemed to buckle beneath their feet, and the air grew heavier, suffocating. The trees creaked and groaned, as if they were alive, and something stirred in the underbrush, something unseen, something waiting. Another scream, but this time it wasn't distant. It was right beside them, too close to ignore. Then, a voice, Leah's voice again, calling from the shadows. "Leah, help us." "Where is that coming from?" Emma shouted, her voice breaking with fear. Leah spun, trying to pinpoint the source, but the forest was a maze of twisted trees, shadows, and mist. With every step they took, the voices grew louder and closer. The screams of terror melded with their own cries until the forest was filled with an endless chorus of agonized wails, their voices, trapped, scattered throughout the trees. "We're not alone," Marcus said, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. They're us." The trees seemed to shift again, and the clearing where the totems stood twisted before their eyes. The faces carved into the wood were no longer just faces, they were moving, their mouths widening in silent screams, their eyes filled with unimaginable terror. The forest was alive. With a final, ear-splitting scream, the totems cracked and splintered, their faces turning toward them as the ground beneath their feet shook violently. The world around them seemed to dissolve into a blur of shadows and voices, until, with one final scream of agony, the forest swallowed them whole. When the search teams arrived days later, there was no sign of the hikers. No trace of their camp, no footprints, not even a broken branch. The forest had taken them, and in its place stood the totems, now silent. But if you listen closely on a moonless night, you might hear something, faint, distant, and unmistakable. The screams of those who vanished into the forest, their voices forever lost in the darkness. And if you're unlucky, you might hear your own name, whispered from the trees, because once you enter the screaming forest, you never leave, not truly. Story 6. The Forgotten Floor. James had worked in the same office building for 5 years. He knew the layout better than he knew the back streets of his own neighborhood. The elevator came and went with regularity. The hum of fluorescent lights was as familiar as the sound of his own breath, and the beige walls seemed to stretch on forever in every direction. His life was routine, structured, and predictable. That was until the day he discovered the forgotten floor. It started on a Tuesday, a day like any other. James was headed to the elevator after his lunch break when he noticed something strange. The building's elevators, which had always been well maintained and functional, seemed to be behaving oddly. The display panel for the floors flickered as he pressed the button for the 14th floor. For a brief moment, the number 13 appeared on the screen before it quickly vanished, replaced by the 14. James frowned. He had been in the building hundreds of times, and there was no 13th floor. It was one of those unspoken rules in buildings with elevators. Some buildings simply didn't have a 13th floor. It was bad luck, superstition, or perhaps just a quirk of architecture. But as he glanced at the display again, he swore he saw it. The button for the 13th floor was there, glowing faintly as if calling to him. His curiosity got the best of him. When the elevator arrived, he hesitated only for a moment before pressing the button for the 13th floor. The doors closed with a soft hiss, and the elevator lurched upward, moving in a way that felt almost wrong. It wasn't the smooth, quiet ascent he was used to. The lift seemed to groan with every floor it passed as if it was reluctant to continue. The doors opened with a slight squeal. At first glance, the floor seemed ordinary, if a little too quiet. The lights were dim, flickering in a way that reminded James of an old horror movie. The air was musty and stale, with an unmistakable scent of dust and decay. The floor was covered in thick carpet that hadn't been cleaned in years, and the walls were lined with faded office doors, all of them shut tightly. There were no signs indicating what businesses operated here, no nameplates or directories. The oddest part, though, was the silence. It was a silence that felt heavy, almost unnatural. No hum of computers. No chatter or rustling of papers. Just a profound stillness, like the entire floor had been abandoned for years. James stepped out of the elevator, his shoes sinking into the worn carpet. He had no idea why he'd decided to explore this hidden floor, but there was something about it that both intrigued and terrified him. The fact that it was there, hidden away, suggested it hadn't been touched in ages. As he walked down the hall, he noticed the doors were slightly ajar. His curiosity pushed him to peek inside. Each office was eerily similar, old desks covered in yellowing papers, typewriters that looked like they hadn't been used in decades, and walls lined with outdated calendars. It was as though the offices hadn't been touched in years, but the space had been frozen in time. That he ventured deeper into the floor, finding more offices. The further he went, the stranger the scene became. There were no signs of human life. No chairs pulled up to the desks. No jackets left on the backs of chairs. It was as though the entire floor had been abandoned abruptly, yet the objects and clutter still remained as if waiting for someone to return. Then, he found it, a desk that seemed familiar. The nameplate on the front was worn, the letters barely legible, but James could make out the name, James Baldwin. His own name, James, froze. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sort of strange coincidence. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His fingers hovered over the papers on the desk. They were typed documents, yellowed with age, some of them so faded that the ink had started to disappear. He picked one up, a few lines of text still visible. It was a detailed account of his life, the same events he had lived through, his childhood, his school years, his first job. But as his eyes scanned the document, his breath caught in his throat. The next section detailed events that hadn't happened yet. James Baldwin will arrive at the 13th floor on the afternoon of April 10, 2024. He will experience an unsettling feeling of déjà vu as he explores the abandoned offices. He will encounter a figure he recognizes, but cannot remember from his past. His curiosity will lead him deeper into the forgotten floor. He dropped the paper as if it had burned him. How could this be possible? He hadn't been on the 13th floor until now. And what was this about encountering someone he recognized? The air seemed to grow colder. The lights above him flickered more violently, casting strange shadows across the offices. He turned to leave, but as he did, he caught a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye. A figure stood at the end of the hall, silhouetted in the dim light. James' heart raced. The figure was tall, with broad shoulders, and though he couldn't make out any details, he knew it was someone from his past. Someone he hadn't thought about in years. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. "Hello," James called out, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who's there?" There was no response. The figure remained still. Something inside James snapped. He didn't know what it was, fear, or a compulsion to know more, but he took a step forward. As soon as he did, the figure vanished into thin air. A sudden noise erupted behind him, and James spun around. The office doors were closing on their own, one by one, as if the floor itself were alive, reacting to his presence. He stumbled back, his pulse pounding in his ears. The papers on the desk caught his eye again. He picked one up, hands trembling. This time, the paper was more specific. It described the very moment he was standing in. His exploration. His shock. The figure he had just seen. And then the text continued, "James Baldwin will attempt to leave the floor. The floor will not let him." His breath caught in his throat as the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut. The elevator, the only way out, was no longer where it had been. It had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall. Panic set in. James bolted toward the nearest exit, but every door he tried was locked, the handles cold and unyielding. The lights flickered again, casting long shadows, and James felt the weight of something unseen watching him, following him, closing in on him. As he ran through the halls, he passed other offices, and with each passing one, the air grew heavier. The walls seemed to close in. The desk with his name on it seemed to mock him from the corner of his eye. The documents on it had shifted, now detailing the exact moments that had led him to this point, and the ones still to come. He will never leave. With every step, the realization hit him harder. The floor was not just abandoned. It was alive. It had been waiting for him, watching him. And now, it would not let him go. He turned a corner and found himself face to face with the figure again. This time, it was clearer. His own face, his own body, only older, as though looking at himself from a future he could not remember. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at him. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice echoing in the silence, but the words were not spoken. They were felt. James stumbled backward, his chest tight, and then, in an instant, the floor seemed to tilt. The walls bent inward, the ceiling cracked open, and the entire floor collapsed, pulling him into the abyss of forgotten spaces. The next morning, the building resumed its routine, as if nothing had happened. The 13th floor was gone, as if it had never existed. The elevator panel showed only 12 and 14. No one would ever know what happened to James Baldwin. But if you listen closely, there are whispers in the hallways of that building. Whispers about a man who wandered into a place where time and space no longer mattered, and who, in the deepest corners of that forgotten floor, discovered a truth he was never meant to know, and if you press the button for the 13th floor, well, sometimes, it answers back. Story 7. The Echoing Lake. The lake didn't appear on any maps. Hidden deep within an overgrown forest, it was surrounded by legends as old as the trees that concealed it. Locals called it the Echoing Lake, a name that carried warnings about strange whispers and even stranger disappearances. But for Carter, Jenna, Ryan, and Ellie, the lake was nothing more than a ghost story, a challenge to conquer on their weekend camping trip. "Just think of the pictures," Jenna said, grinning as she hoisted her backpack higher on her shoulders. "We'll be the first people to post about the Echoing Lake." Carter laughed. "If it even exists. For all we know, it's just some swamp with a spooky name." Ellie, the quietest of the group, trailed behind, glancing nervously at the trees. The forest was dense, the air thick with the earthy smell of moss and decay. Every now and then, she thought she heard something, soft murmurs, like voices carried on the wind. But when she stopped to listen, there was only silence. They reached the lake just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. It was smaller than they had imagined, an oval of perfectly still water framed by gnarled trees. The surface was so smooth it looked like glass, reflecting the darkening sky above. The silence here was deafening, even the forest sounds, birds, insects, seemed to stop as they approached. Ryan whistled. "Well, this is creepy." "Creepy and beautiful," Jenna said, already snapping pictures with her phone. "This place is unreal." Carter shrugged off his pack and set up the tents, while Ellie hung back, staring at the water. Something about it unsettled her. The way it seemed too perfect, too undisturbed. As if it were waiting. "Hey, Ellie," Carter called. "Don't zone out. Help me with the firewood." She nodded and turned away, but not before she thought she saw something in the reflection. A ripple, despite the fact that no one had touched the water. The night was quiet, save for the crackling of their campfire. They roasted marshmallows and joked about the lake's reputation, though their laughter sounded hollow in the unnatural stillness. "Why do they call it the Echoing Lake, anyway?" Ryan asked, leaning back on his elbows. Jenna shrugged. "Something about whispers, right? People say they hear voices around here." "Voices of what?" Carter asked, smirking. "Ghosts? Who knows?" Jenna replied. "Maybe the wind. Or maybe it's the people who went missing out here." Ellie shivered. "Missing?" "Yeah." Jenna's tone was casual, but her words were anything but. "The stories go back decades. People come here, hear the lake calling to them, and then, they're gone. Some say they drown, others think they just get lost in the woods. But no one's ever found a body." "That's comforting," Ellie muttered, hugging her knees. "Relax." Ryan threw a marshmallow at her. "They're just stories." But as the fire burned low and the night deepened, the group fell into an uneasy silence. The whispers began around midnight. Faint at first, just a soft murmur that could have been the wind, but soon, the sound became unmistakable. Voices, low and melodic, drifting across the water. Carter was the first to notice. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenna frowned, tilting her head. "It's probably just the trees." "No," Ellie said, her face pale. "It's voices." They all turned toward the lake. The water was still, reflecting the stars and the crescent moon above. But as they stared, the surface began to ripple. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but then more violently, as though something beneath the surface was stirring. And then, they saw them. Reflections, faint and distorted, rose to the surface of the lake. At first, they were indistinct shapes, but as the ripples subsided, the images sharpened. 4 figures stared back at them from the water, but they weren't ordinary reflections. The figures moved on their own, their mouths moving silently, mouthing words the campers couldn't hear. "What the hell?" Ryan stepped closer, his voice trembling. The figures in the lake mimicked their movements, but their expressions were all wrong. While the campers were frozen in fear, the reflections looked eager. Their mouths formed strange, silent words, their eyes wide and unblinking. "They're saying something," Ellie whispered, her voice shaking. Jenna leaned in closer, trying to decipher the movements of her reflection's lips. Her own reflection tilted its head, smiling faintly as it mouthed a single word, "Come." Jenna staggered back. It's talking to me." Carter shook his head. "This is insane. It's just a trick of the water." But even as he spoke, his own reflection began to mouth words. At first, he tried to ignore it, but then curiosity got the better of him. He leaned closer, his reflection meeting his gaze. The words became clearer, though he couldn't hear them. They weren't random, they were specific. Secrets. The truth. Ryan was the first to give in. "What if," he said, his voice barely audible. "What if it's real? What if the lake knows something? Something we don't?" "Don't," Ellie pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Don't touch it." But Ryan shook her off, stepping closer to the edge. His reflection smiled, its mouth moving faster now, whispering promises he couldn't hear. And then, before anyone could stop him, he reached out and touched the water. The change was instantaneous. The surface of the lake erupted, pulling him in with a force that sent Ellie and Jenna tumbling backward. Ryan screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of the water. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the lake stilled. Ryan was gone. "Ryan!" Jenna screamed, rushing to the edge. But there was no trace of him. Only his reflection remained, staring up at them from the water. It was no longer silent. Its mouth moved, forming words that echoed in the still air. "Join me." Ellie grabbed Jenna, pulling her back from the edge. "We have to go," she said, her voice shaking. "We have to leave. Now." But the lake wasn't done. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping in a cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The reflections began to multiply, filling the lake until it was a writhing mass of distorted faces, all mouthing the same word, "Come." Carter tried to run, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, pulling him closer to the water. His reflection reached up, its arms breaking the surface of the lake, grasping at him. He screamed, struggling against the invisible force dragging him toward the edge, but it was no use. The lake claimed him, his body vanishing beneath the surface. His reflection smiled, its mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. Ellie and Jenna ran, the whispers chasing them through the forest. The path they had taken was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The lake's voice followed them, promising secrets, revealing truths they didn't want to hear. By dawn, only Ellie stumbled out of the forest, her clothes torn, her face pale and hollow. She refused to speak of what had happened, of the friends she had lost, of the whispers that still echoed in her mind. The echoing lake remained, waiting for the next curious souls to wander too close. The reflections lingered, their silent mouths moving in unison, calling for more. And the lake, always hungry, promised it would never be alone. Story 8. The Clockmaker's Curse. The package appeared on a crisp autumn morning, sitting neatly on the Davenport family's doorstep. It was unmarked, save for a single word scrawled in elegant handwriting on the wrapping paper, for the Davenports. It must be a mistake, Margaret Davenport said, brushing her graying hair from her face as she inspected the package. She looked up and down the street, but there was no delivery van, no neighbor in sight. Just the eerie quiet of their suburban cul-de-sac. Maybe it's a gift, her husband, Richard, suggested. Or some weird promotion. Who sends an antique clock as a promotion? Margaret muttered, eyeing the package. But her curiosity got the better of her, and she brought it inside. Their teenage son, Ben, joined them in the living room as Margaret carefully peeled away the brown paper to reveal the clock. It was a stunning piece of craftsmanship, a wooden grandfather clock, polished to a rich mahogany sheen. The intricate carvings of vines and roses curled up its long body, and its brass pendulum gleamed in the afternoon light. But there was something unsettling about it. The clock face was adorned with numbers etched in strange symbols, almost runic, and the hands were jet black, long and sharp like needles. Creepy, Ben said, wrinkling his nose. It looks like something from a horror movie. Margaret frowned. Don't be ridiculous. It's beautiful. But who would send us something like this? There was no note inside the package. No sender. No explanation. The clock began to chime later that evening. At first, the sound was soft, a low, resonant toll that echoed through the house. Margaret was reading in the living room when it struck 7. She glanced at it, frowning. She hadn't wound it, nor had anyone else. It was supposed to be an antique. How was it running? Richard, did you wind the clock? She called out. Her husband poked his head into the room. No. Why? It's working. Richard raised an eyebrow but shrugged. It's probably mechanical. Maybe it still had some life left in it. Margaret wasn't convinced. Something about the clock unsettled her, but she pushed the feeling aside. It was just a clock, after all. By the time the clock struck 8, the first accident had happened. Ben had gone out for a late bike ride, as he often did, but this time he returned home pale and shaken, his bike twisted and dented. "A car came out of nowhere," he said, his voice trembling. "It missed me by inches. If I hadn't swerved." He didn't finish the sentence, his hands trembling as he clutched his helmet. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced at the clock. Its hands pointed to 8, and the pendulum swung steadily, ticking away the seconds. "It's just a coincidence," she told herself. But her voice didn't sound convincing, even to her own ears. When the clock struck 9, the second accident happened. Richard was in the garage, fixing a loose shelf. Margaret was in the kitchen when she heard the crash. She ran to find him sprawled on the floor, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. The shelf had fallen, narrowly missing his head but sending tools scattering across the floor. "I don't know what happened," Richard said, dabbing at the wound with a towel. "It just gave way." Margaret's gaze darted back to the clock in the living room. Its black hands now pointed to 9, and the ticking seemed louder, more deliberate. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching them. By 10 o'clock, Margaret was convinced the clock wasn't just a clock. She stood in front of it, studying its face. The runic numbers seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. The pendulum swung back and forth, steady and hypnotic. The closer it got to the hour, the louder the ticking became. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong with this clock." "What are you talking about?" he asked, rubbing his bandaged head. "2 accidents. 2 chimes. It's not a coincidence." Richard stared at her, his expression skeptical. "You're letting this thing get to you. It's just an old clock." But Margaret wasn't convinced. She tried to stop it, pulling the pendulum to a halt. But the moment she released it, it resumed its relentless swing, as if mocking her. At 11, Margaret's worst fears were confirmed. She was in the kitchen when she heard a sharp scream from upstairs. She bolted up the stairs to find Ellie, her 6-year-old granddaughter, clutching her arm. A heavy mirror had fallen from the wall, narrowly missing her but shattering across the floor. "I was just playing," Ellie cried, tears streaming down her face. "It fell on its own." Margaret's heart pounded as she carried Ellie downstairs. The clock struck 11, its chime echoing ominously. She stared at the clock face, her breath shallow. "Richard," she said, her voice firm. "We need to get rid of it. Now." The family tried everything. They moved the clock to the garage, but its chimes still echoed through the house. They tried smashing it with a hammer, but the wood didn't even dent. Richard even attempted to burn it in the backyard, but the flames refused to catch. As the clock struck midnight, the air in the house grew heavy and oppressive. The hands of the clock moved faster now, ticking toward the next hour with unnatural speed. "What happens when it reaches midnight?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. No one had an answer. The final chime came just as the clock struck 12. The air grew cold, and the house fell into complete silence. The family stood frozen, staring at the clock, which now seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The pendulum stopped. The hands stilled. And then the clock spoke. In a voice that was neither human nor mechanical, It whispered, "The debt is paid." Before anyone could react, the clock erupted into splinters, a deafening crack echoing through the room. When the dust settled, the Davenports were gone. The house stood empty for years after that. Neighbors whispered about the family's sudden disappearance, about the strange clock that no one could explain. And though the clock was never seen again, its story persisted, a cautionary tale about an antique cursed by the sins of its maker. But sometimes, on quiet nights, those who pass the old Davenport house swear they hear it still, a faint ticking, growing louder with each passing second. Story 9. The Veiled Roommate. Megan wasn't expecting much when she arrived at college: freedom, late-night study sessions, maybe even a new best friend. But when she stepped into her dorm room for the first time, her expectations dropped like a stone. The room was small, musty, and dimly lit, with only a narrow window that overlooked the side of another building. The bare walls seemed to absorb sound, leaving the air unnaturally heavy. Her roommate, a girl named Lila, was already there, sitting on the bed closest to the window. She didn't look up as Megan entered. Instead, she sat motionless, her head tilted down as if studying her hands, which were hidden beneath long sleeves. "Hi," Megan said, setting her suitcase down. "I'm Megan." Lila didn't respond. Megan hesitated, glancing at the girl's profile. She was draped in a pale veil that obscured her entire face, thin enough to show the faint outline of features but opaque enough to keep them hidden. It wasn't a hijab or anything cultural that Megan recognized, it was something else entirely. "Okay. I guess I'll just unpack," Megan muttered, trying to shake off the unease prickling at her skin. Over the next few days, Megan tried to be friendly, but Lila remained silent. She never spoke, never left the room, and barely moved. She spent most of her time sitting by the window, staring at nothing in particular. When Megan asked why she wore the veil, Lila didn't answer. Weird, Megan thought, but maybe she just needs space. Still, strange things began to happen. At night, the room grew unnaturally cold, even with the heater on full blast. Megan often woke to a faint humming sound, low and melodic, as if someone were singing just beyond her hearing. And then there were the shadows. At first, Megan thought she was imagining things, movement in the corners of her vision, a flicker of darkness where there shouldn't be any. But one night, as she lay awake in her bed, she saw a figure standing at the foot of Lila's bed. It was tall and indistinct, its edges dissolving into the dark. "Lila?" Megan whispered, her voice trembling. The figure turned its head toward her, but before Megan could scream, it vanished. Megan tried to spend as much time as possible outside the dorm. She studied in the library, hung out with friends, and even started going to parties she didn't care about, anything to avoid the suffocating atmosphere of her room. But no matter where she went, she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. One evening, she returned to the dorm late, her head buzzing from too much cheap beer. She found Lila sitting exactly where she always did, by the window. Megan dropped her bag onto her bed and froze. "Lila, what is wrong with you?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Lila didn't respond. I mean, what's with the veil? The humming? The shadows? Megan's voice broke. I'm trying to be patient, but you're really freaking me out. Still, Lila didn't move. Megan's frustration boiled over. She crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed the edge of the veil. If you won't talk, then, she yanked it off. For a moment, Megan couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. Lila's face was a twisted mockery of human features, a horrifying amalgamation of shifting flesh and dark, empty voids where her eyes should have been. Her mouth wasn't a mouth at all but a gaping chasm, pulsing as if it were alive. Megan screamed, stumbling backward. The air around her warped, the shadows in the room growing longer and darker, closing in on her. She fell to the floor, clutching her head as a searing pain tore through her mind. When she came to, the veil was back in place, and Lila was sitting by the window, motionless as ever. But something was wrong. Megan couldn't remember her parents' faces. She couldn't remember her best friend's name. Entire pieces of her life had been erased, leaving behind a gnawing emptiness. From that night on, Megan started seeing her veiled roommate everywhere. In the library, she caught a glimpse of the pale veil disappearing around a corner. At the coffee shop, she saw Lila sitting at a table in the back, staring at her. Even in her dreams, Lila was there, standing silently in the distance, her humming growing louder until it drowned out all other sounds. Megan tried to tell herself it wasn't real, that she was imagining things. But when she returned to the dorm one evening, she found something that shattered her fragile denial. Her reflection in the mirror had changed. Her face was still hers, but her eyes, they were hollow. Empty. Like Lila's. Desperate, Megan sought help. She went to the campus counselor, who listened patiently as Megan poured out her story. It's not possible, the counselor said gently. You don't have a roommate, Megan. Your dorm application was for a single room. No, that's not true. Megan protested. Lila's real. But when she returned to her dorm, Lila's bed was gone. The window was closed, the room exactly as it had been on her first day. There was no sign Lila had ever existed. Megan dropped out of college a month later. She couldn't concentrate, couldn't sleep. The shadows followed her everywhere, and the humming never stopped. She avoided mirrors, afraid of what she might see. Years later, after she'd moved far from the campus and tried to rebuild her life, she heard the humming again. It was faint at first, just on the edge of her hearing, but it grew louder with each passing day. One night, she woke to find a veiled figure standing at the foot of her bed. It wasn't Lila. It was her. The veil slipped away, revealing a face she no longer recognized. And as the shadows closed in around her, Megan finally understood. She hadn't been the first. And she wouldn't be the last. Story 10. The Forgotten Guest. When Emma and Daniel first saw the countryside home, it felt like destiny. The old stone walls, the creaking wooden floors, and the overgrown garden all exuded a charm that called to them. They purchased it on the spot, dreaming of cozy nights by the fireplace and lazy mornings with coffee in the sunlit kitchen. It wasn't until they moved in that they noticed the antique dining table. The table stood in the middle of the dining room, an elaborate piece of craftsmanship with intricately carved legs and a polished surface that gleamed in the soft light. But what caught their attention most was the set of mismatched chairs around it, 6 in total, though one chair stood out. This chair was smaller, child-sized, and unadorned compared to the others. What was strange, though, was that it wasn't positioned around the table like the others. Instead, it sat slightly apart, facing the corner of the room. "That's odd," Emma said, tilting her head. Daniel shrugged. "Probably just someone's idea of decor. We can move it later." But when Daniel tried to lift the chair to move it against the wall, something stopped him. A sound, soft, barely audible, whispered, "Please don't take my seat." Daniel froze. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Hear what?" Emma replied, frowning. He looked at her, his face pale. "I swear I just heard something." Emma shook her head. "You're probably just tired. Let's unpack and worry about the creepy chair later." But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Over the following weeks, life in the house took on an uneasy rhythm. The chair remained in its corner, untouched, yet it seemed to draw their attention no matter where they were in the house. Emma swore she heard faint giggles at night, like a child's laugh carried on the wind. Daniel, on the other hand, started waking up in the middle of the night to find the chair slightly turned, as if it were looking toward the table. One morning, while dusting the dining room, Emma decided she'd had enough. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself. She grabbed the chair and dragged it to the garage, but as soon as she let go, the temperature in the room plummeted. A chilling draft swept through the house, slamming doors and rattling windows. Emma stumbled backward, her breath visible in the icy air. And then she heard it. "Please don't take my seat," the voice whimpered. Terrified, Emma fled to the garage to find Daniel. Together, they returned the chair to its original spot, where it stood as if nothing had happened. They decided not to touch the chair again. Instead, Emma began researching the history of the house. She learned it had once belonged to the Whitaker family, who had lived there for generations before mysteriously disappearing in the early 1900s. The youngest member of the family, a boy named Theodore, had died tragically at the age of 8, though the details of his death were vague. "That's unsettling," Daniel said when Emma shared what she'd found. "You think this is Theo's chair?" Emma nodded, her face pale. "Maybe. But why would he still be here? And why that chair?" Daniel didn't have an answer, but they both agreed to leave the chair alone. Things came to a head the night of their dinner party. Emma and Daniel had invited a few friends over, hoping to distract themselves from the growing unease in their home. The evening began well enough, with laughter and wine filling the dining room. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavy. The temperature dropped, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the table. One of their friends, Sarah, pointed at the corner. "Why is that chair just sitting there like that?" she asked. Just leave it, Emma said quickly. But Sarah, emboldened by a few glasses of wine, got up and walked toward the chair. It's just a chair, she said with a nervous laugh. What's the big deal? As she reached for it, the chair turned on its own, slowly pivoting to face the table. The room plunged into an unnatural cold, and the lights flickered. Who's there? Sarah whispered, her bravado gone. And then, they all heard it, "Thank you for saving my seat." A figure materialized in the chair, a childlike form, pale and translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to peer straight into their souls. The entity's voice was soft but chilling. "I've waited so long," it said, its tone a mixture of sorrow and menace. "You didn't forget me, did you?" The guests froze, unable to move or speak. The entity's gaze swept across the room, lingering on each person before settling on Emma and Daniel. "You live here now," it said. "So you must remember. Always." And then, with a final, bone-chilling laugh, the figure faded, leaving the chair rocking gently in its place. The party ended abruptly, with guests making hasty excuses and fleeing the house. Emma and Daniel were left alone, staring at the chair. "We can't stay here," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. But when they tried to leave the next morning, the front door wouldn't open. Neither would the windows. It was as if the house itself had locked them in. That night, they heard the voice again, whispering through the walls. "Don't forget me. Don't forget my seat." The chair remains in its corner to this day, a silent sentinel. And Emma and Daniel? No one's seen them in years. But if you pass by the house on a quiet night, you might hear the faint creak of a rocking chair, and a child's soft laughter echoing through the air.